the brain is basically designed to be customized in the early part of life, and then to implement those algorithms and that circuitry for the rest of its life. And so the brain can change in adulthood, and it can change provided that there's an emphasis on some perceptual event. So in other words, if you want to change your brain as an adult, let's say you want to be less anxious, you want to learn a new language, you want to be more functional in some way, presumably. The key thing is to bring focus to some particular perception of something that's happening during the learning process. And the reason for that is that there's a neurochemical system involving acetylcholine. And it comes from these two little nuclei down in the base of the brain called nucleus basalis. All day long, you're doing things in a reflexive way. But when you do something and you think about it very intensely, acetylcholine is released from basalis at the precise neurons that were involved in that behavior, and it marks those for change during sleep or during deep rest later. So for people that want to change their brain, the power of focus is really the entry point, and the ability to access deep rest and sleep. Because most people don't realize this, but neuroplasticity is triggered by intense focus. But neuroplasticity occurs during deep sleep and rest. One of the things that's really important also to think about how the brain works in terms of plasticity and all this stuff is what the brain really wants to do is also pass as much of what it does off to reflexive behavior as possible. So, so when we're talking about focus, I think it can get a little bit vague, but it might be useful to think about like what exactly is focus and what triggers plasticity. So the brain loves to be able to just do things, pick up coffee cups and drink and walk and talk and do things and not put much energy into it. When we decide to focus, what the brain really does is it switches on a set of circuits that involve the frontal cortex and nucleus basalis and some others, and it's trying to understand duration, how long something's going to last, path, what's going to happen, and outcome, what ultimately is going to happen. So duration, path, and outcome. You know, the events of early 2020 are a good example of this. One of the reasons why it's so exhausting to be alive in 2020 is because we are now having to pay attention to duration, path, and outcome. How long is this thing going to last? When are they going to open up all businesses? Did I touch that door handle? Does it matter?
Right.
Who are the experts? Are there any experts? There are a lot of questions, whereas normally we can just move through life without having to do all that analysis. So if it's a simple example like trying to learn a new language or a new motor skill or a new way of conceptualizing something, maybe somebody's in a therapeutic process and they're trying to work through a trauma or something like that, duration, path, and outcome is built into the networks of the brain. We can do that very easily, but it takes work. And it almost has a feeling of underlying agitation and frustration. And that's because the circuits that turn on before acetylcholine are of the stress system. So when you or I decide we're going to learn something and really dig in, norepinephrine, which is adrenaline, is secreted in the brainstem and in the body, and it brings about a state of alertness. Then our attention, which is mostly a diffuse light, is brought to a particular duration, path, and outcome analysis. This would be thinking about what somebody is saying. What are they really trying to say? A hard passage of reading, a hard set of math problems, a challenging physical workout. When you do that, these two systems have to work very hard, and the adult brain doesn't really want to change the algorithms it learned in childhood. But if you do those two things, you have alertness and focus. The acetylcholine and the norepinephrine converge to mark those synapses for change. And so the way to think about neuroplasticity, if one wants to change their brain, is bring about the most intense concentration you can to something, and then later bring about the least amount of concentration to that thing.
Need motivation?
Watch a top 10 with Believe Nation.
Top 10, I got a top 10. Got my motivation high for my top 10. Gotta learn from the wise women and men. All my life, like 9 and 9. For my top 10, top 10, 9 and 9. This one's for my top 10.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because you are probably the most ambitious person in your circle, but you know you're capable of more. And you get that push by surrounding yourself with the best. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Dr. Andrew Huberman, and my take on his top 10 rules for success. Enjoy. Rule number 2, move to action.
Forward movement, provided it doesn't endanger you or kill you, is
absolutely the remedy for fear, stress, and at least in the clinical literature, to these sort of trauma events, that people carry with them for many years. Of course, trauma needs to be dealt with, hopefully with a professional, but we can all apply these mechanisms and these neurochemical reward schedules. So the study that you're referring to is a beautiful one. There's a classic study where researchers, not my lab, put 2 rats, or you could do this with mice, into a tube. And the tendency is for them to try and push one or the other one out. One always wins and pushes the other one out. We call the one that got pushed out the loser, the one that pushed them out the winner. Here are the interesting things about this. First of all, the winner will tend to win in other battles, even though these are just pushing battles, more because it simply won the time before. The loser, by losing, will tend to lose. And so people say, oh, well, that explains a lot about society, et cetera. Well, here's where it gets really interesting. You can even take a mouse or a rat and push it from behind and make it the winner. And then on subsequent trials where you're not pushing it, it will tend to win more often. So the win doesn't even have to come from itself. So last year, there was a very important paper published about this, where a set of researchers just said, well, what is it? Like, what is this winning circuit and this losing circuit? Enough with the demonstration that this happens. Like, what's happening what's under the hood? And so they went into the brain and they identified a brain area, which is part of the frontal cortex, the area that we typically think about planning, action, executive function, all the kind of high level stuff. And what they discovered was this brain area is more active in the winner than in the loser. In fact, they could take the loser and overstimulate this area and turn the losers into winners. Now, it gets even more ridiculous than that. If you quiet this brain area, winners become losers, okay? And if you take a winner and let's say at this tube battle, and you put them into, let's say, a cold environment with a bunch of other mice, and you have just a warm corner, mice don't like to be cold, and you say, who gets the warm corner, right? Who gets the luxury spot? It's always the winner. So it even breaks down at the level of social interactions. And so you say, okay, all right, now we know that it's this brain area, it's this one area of the frontal cortex, but what's it actually doing, right? Okay, what's it actually, how can we translate this? Turns out this brain area that's responsible and required for winning in this series of experiments is actually driving up the level of activation, what you and I would call agitation or stress, to the point where that animal is more likely to move forward. It's simply taking stress, which is wired into us in order to make us feel agitated, instead of suppressing us, instead of saying, I'm just going to sit here, I'm overwhelmed, I'm not going to do it, I'm just going to move into action. So there's a circuit for winning. There's the same circuit when it's hypoactive, not active enough, is what causes losing in these competitive scenarios. And similarly, there's a circuit for quitting. There's a norepinephrine circuit in the brainstem. This was published in the last couple of years, showing that when animals or people are in constant effort, eventually that level of norepinephrine gets so high that it triggers a circuit that shuts down the motor control over the limbs, and you just say, that's it, I give up, I'm done. So these mechanisms were hardwired into us. We all have them. Whether or not it's from evolution, Mother Nature, God, the universe, it's irrelevant to the discussion that these circuits exist in everybody. And I think it's a select few people who really understand that forward action is what drives these circuits. It's the ability to take that agitation, stress, agitation, increase our focus, and they bias us for movement. And nature wanted that. They want us to move forward in the face of challenge, not to be quiescent. We weren't sitting around battling tigers and saber-toothed tigers all the time. More likely, we were in caves and we were getting hungry and we had to go out and search for things. Agitation and stress were designed to get us up and move us. And when we try and fight that too much and we try and quiet that stress, that actually can be problematic. You have to decide, are you going to try and quiet stress, or are you going to actually lean into action? That's a critical choice point for everybody who's experienced anything negative or positive for that matter.
Rule number 3, divorce the mind and body.
The mind plays an important role in interpreting whether or not it's overwhelming or tolerable. So intense breathing like tumo breathing, or ice baths or cold showers, or intense exercise like high intensity interval training type stuff, teaches the mind to be comfortable in these higher stress states, where, in other words, it teaches people to be comfortable when they have a lot of adrenaline in their body. This is basically stress inoculation. But stress inoculation is not about not getting stressed. It's actually about divorcing the mind-body relationship a bit so that you're calm in the mind when your body is very amplified.
Stress.
Yeah, so if you've ever done tumo-type breathing or you've done a cold shower, the goal is to get the adrenaline release.
And then calm your mind.
And then calm your mind.
Rule number 4, understand the nervous system.
The nervous system is designed to orchestrate all the processes in the body, not just thinking and not just behavior. It really can be divided into 5 things. So there's sensation, and sensation is really bound or restricted by the receptors in the body. So receptors in the eye that perceive photons, light energy, receptors in the skin that perceive pressure, touch receptors, smell, taste, hearing, etc. And the interesting thing about sensation and the fact that the nervous system needs to pay attention to sensation is it's non-negotiable. The nervous system of humans is designed to extract physical phenomenon from the universe that are non-negotiable, photons of light. I can't see in the infrared with my eyes, and I can't see ultraviolet light with my eyes, and I can't perceive that because I don't have the receptors for it. So, other animals can perceive some of those things, but that leads us to the next thing, which is perception, which is which sensations are you paying attention to? So all the time you're sensing things. Like right now, your feet are sensing the contact with your shoes, but you're not thinking about it until I say that, and then you shift your perception. Right. So perception is like this spotlight. So the brain wants to constantly bring in sensation. It's non-negotiable what's coming in. It's just dependent on your environment. Perception is negotiable. You can control that because I just said shoes and you thought about your feet and there you are. Then there are feelings, which can be a little bit nebulous, but feelings are a link between our emotion and it generally invokes the body, sensations in the body and concepts in the mind of what those sensations are about. That's really what emotions are. Animals definitely experience them. I'm kind of appalled to think that 10 years ago, people were like, do animals have emotions? Of course they have emotions, right? Because those are bodily sensations merged with some perception. So of course they do. And then there's thoughts. And thoughts are interesting because thoughts happen spontaneously. Think about like a web browser that's constantly giving you pop-ups. But thoughts can also be deliberate. So you and I can decide right now that we're gonna think about a plan for something, or we're gonna think about what's going on in the world. So thoughts happen spontaneously and they can be deliberate. And then the final thing is behaviors and actions. So the nervous system is responsible for sensation, perception, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And what's interesting, you start to think about that as you're like, okay, that's a lot, but what is the nervous system really trying to accomplish? Like on any given day or at any moment, what's it trying to accomplish? And it's really trying to accomplish one thing, which is to take perceptions of the outside world and merge those with perceptions of the inside world, what we call interoception, and to link those in a way that's operating on our environment in the appropriate way. So what do I mean by that? So if I'm feeling anxious and I'm in a very calm environment, I'm gonna perceive that rapid heart rate and kind of feeling of agitation in my body as inappropriate for the moment, right? And my goal then as an organism is to adjust my level of what they call autonomic arousal or alertness down. If I'm at a great party or I'm at a wedding or it's a celebration or I'm at a protest or, then I might feel that my level of alertness is appropriate for my environment. So the nervous system is in this constant dynamic interaction with the outside world and trying to figure that out. One way that this can be kind of conceptualized is there's an emerging idea that's kind of interesting about impatience. So we've all had the feeling of being impatient. Some people are far more patient than others. But if you've ever been in line at the store and you feel like something's going very slowly, the person in front of you is taking a long time, they're doing some returns, and you're getting kind of impatient, maybe you're breathing in a mask, and you're like, ugh, like what's the idea is that if you're getting a certain frequency of pulses from your body, and if those pulses are coming in quickly, like you're perceiving yourself, that interoception quickly, it's like pulse, 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 pulse. You're gonna be more geared towards your internal representation. And then you're seeing what's going on in the outside world, and it seems like it's going very slowly. But there are other times when you're in line at the store, someone's getting some returns and you're texting on your phone, or you've had a great day, you've had a great run, your family's in great shape, and you're fine. Why? Well, the frequency of those pulses, that interoception, is matched pretty well to your outside environment. And so impatience is really when your internal sort of metronome, tick, 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 is not matched well to the external environment. There are other times when you're feeling like your internal metronome is tick, 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 and you've got a million things coming at you through email or text, and you've got a bunch of things, and you're feeling overwhelmed and tired. Well, in either case, there's nothing right or wrong. It's just your body and your brain are trying to say, what's going on in the outside world and how well matched am I to it?
Right.
So if you think about some of the sort of core practices of mindfulness and self-regulation, of like focusing on breathing or focusing on state of mind, a lot of that is trying to bring more awareness to your internal state. But what our brain is normally doing when our eyes are open and we're interacting in the world is we're constantly trying to update our internal state to match external demands of the world. And this harkens back to a really early design of all nervous systems, which is, how do you take an organism that needs certain things, food, water, mates, reproduction, shelter, how do you move that organism? How do you create a system that will do that in best relation to the environment? And so what Mother Nature has done is designed a series of systems. Let's just take agitation and stress for one. If an animal or a human is very thirsty, you feel kind of agitated, you might get up and get a drink of water. If you're very thirsty, it can put you into a state of panic. If you're extremely thirsty and water is a limited resource, you might even resort to violence to get it, or negotiation of some sort that you wouldn't if you were calmer. So the stress and agitation were designed to actually mobilize the body to take us in the direction of something that's adaptive. So you can start to see these kind of core elements of what the brain and nervous system do: sensation, perception, feeling, thought, and action. And this constant challenge of trying to match our internal state to the external real estate, the outside world. And you start to see that the sensations that we call stress or impatience or calm are really the result of those attempts that the nervous system is trying to perform.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there. Rule number 5, make small steps.
And this is what people from elite special forces can do. They know how to make small, simple, physical steps in the real world that allow them to build on these reward circuitries, but they don't get delusional about how they're doing. They know, they keep the end in mind, but they get very micro. They move the horizon in very close. And so if you can move the horizon to something you know you can complete and you reward that, you essentially are where you were before. You're just as strong, if not stronger, but you're heading in the direction you need to go. You're not depleting, you're not spending out anything. And it feels a little weird because none of us like to reward things that aren't external, but the ability to control these internal reward schedules is everything.
Rule number 6, introduce deliberate thoughts.
To what extent does our subjective narrative,
the story we
tell ourselves, actually mean something for the body? And to what extent does the body actually mean something for the subjective narrative? So this gets into some areas of work that we're doing now. And so I do want to highlight that it's ongoing work. But I think, the old narrative, meaning 10 years ago, was that if you're feeling depressed, just smile. Well, if that worked,
right,
we would have a lot less depression than we see out there. The reason I call it a brain-body contract early on is that the brain and the body are constantly in dialogue. So, the idea that when we're depressed, we tend to be in more defensive type postures. When we're feeling good, we tend to be in more like relaxed and extended postures. All true. But it does not mean that just by occupying the extended posture that I'm going to completely shift the mind.
Right.
That's a first step. Think about like 2 interlocking gears. It's one gear that turns the other, but then they need to kind of dance together before you can get the whole system going.
So how do you get it to dance together?
Exactly. So there is one way in which subjective thought and deliberate thought is very powerful over states of mind and body. To answer your question, can you think your way out of the ice bath being cold? So a couple things that are important. First of all, just to go a little deeper on what thoughts are. Thoughts happen spontaneously all the time. Mm-hmm. They're popping up like a poorly filtered internet connection. But thoughts can also be deliberately introduced.
For instance, right now, I can say, okay, have a thought that just decide to write your name. And you can do that. I'm going to decide to write my name, and you can do it. So that's a deliberate thought, which says that you can introduce thoughts. So I think it's very hard to control negative thoughts directly by trying to suppress them. Generally, they tend to just want to continue to geyser up all the time. But we can introduce a positive thought.
Rule number 7, calm down.
An ability to control your levels of stress in real time is extremely powerful. It turns out you can do this using physiology and neuroscience. Your breathing can directly impact your heart rate and your level of stress or calm. Here's how it works. When you inhale, your diaphragm moves down. This creates more space in your thoracic cavity, and your heart actually gets a little bit bigger. As a consequence, the rate of blood flow through that larger heart volume slows down. A signal is sent from a group of neurons on your heart called the sinoatrial node. That signal goes up to the brain, and your brain sends a signal to speed the heart up. In other words, inhaling speeds your heart rate up. The opposite is true as well. When you exhale, your diaphragm moves up. Your heart gets a little bit smaller because there's a little bit less space in your thoracic cavity. As a consequence, blood flows more quickly through that smaller volume. The sinoatrial node registers that and sends a signal to your brain, and the brain sends a signal to slow the heart down. So in other words, inhaling speeds your heart rate up, exhaling slows your heart rate down. So if you want to speed up your heart rate and be more alert, inhale more or make those inhales more vigorous, more intense. If you want to calm down, you can do that quickly by making your exhales slightly longer than your inhales or making them more vigorous. This doesn't require any breath work. This is something that you can do in real time. And that's what's called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. That's the technical phrase. It's also the basis of what's called heart rate variability, or HRV. But all you need to remember is inhaling deeper and longer will speed your heart rate up. Exhaling longer and more intensely will slow your heart rate down and will allow you to calm down in real time.
Rule number 8, practice lateral eye movement.
Acetylcholine is the neurochemical that we want to think about anytime we're talking about neural plasticity, and in particular, attention, high attentional states. So everyone knows that the brain is very plastic early in life. So from birth until about age 25, you can learn so much, for better or for worse. I always say the downside is that early in life, you have less control over your life circumstances, but your brain is very plastic. So there's a, dark and light to that. Later in life, you have a lot more control generally over your life circumstances, but the brain becomes less plastic. However, we know, based on Nobel Prize winning work and recent work in addition to that, that the neuromodulator, acetylcholine, is secreted when we pay attention to something very specific. It acts as sort of a spotlight in the brain, making certain synapses, the connections between neurons, more active and more likely to be active again than others. So when you hear that song that you love so much and it moves you and you feel dopamine being pulsed into your body, that's a real thing. You're actually getting dopamine secretion. You've formed that deep association with that. And acetylcholine draws your attention to that. And that song is essentially wired in a very indelible way into your nervous system at multiple. You can probably, even with certain songs, you can feel your body start to energize because, of course, the brain, through connections with your muscles, controls your body. So for things that are traumatic or negative, what we're really talking about is neural plasticity that's focused on unlearning. And most of the therapies for this, whether or not it's EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or it's traditional psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, or it's somatic embodied release, big, Kundalini breathing type, almost all of those are designed to do something, which is to bring the person, or you bring yourself, into a state of heightened alertness. Right? You can't do this stuff when you're sort of half asleep. Heightened alertness, and then focusing your attention on the traumatic or negative event. This is the way that it works. And then pairing that with something new. Traditionally this was done with things like NLP or in talk therapy, where people would feel the positive relationship with the therapist. That was kind of the main rationale, in association with this very traumatic, sometimes even, shameful type events. And the idea is that you would simultaneously have those two experiences, the negative one and the feeling of safety, and you would rewire those circuitries. I actually believe that can work, but it can take a lot of times. It can take a lot of visits to the therapist, which is not to say it's bad. It's just not everyone has access to those resources. Things like eye movement desensitization reprocessing, simply moving the eyes laterally while recounting these negative events. The woman who devised this figured out that somehow when people recount these traumatic experiences, when they're doing these lateralized eye movements, not vertical eye movements, they somehow separate out the negative emotions. And I thought for years, people would ask me about this stuff, Tom, and I thought, this is ridiculous. First of all, I'm a vision scientist and I work on stress. It's like, there's no way. And then I really ate my words, because 4 papers, 2 in humans, 2 in mice, and then a 5th paper published in Nature, which is kind of our Super Bowl of scientific publishing, showed that these lateralized eye movements quiet the amygdala. They actually suppress activation of this threat detection center in the amygdala. And
why would that be true?
So this is really where it gets cool. Turns out, because of when the way that we view the visual world when we move through space, when our head moves or when we walk and things flow past us, that these lateralized eye movements are what happens when you move forward in space, when you're walking, when you're moving forward towards something. And that suppresses activation of the amygdala. Now you say, why? Well, okay, so then 2018, my laboratory did an experiment. There was actually a graduate student in my laboratory where we're looking at fear. In this case, we were looking at fear to big looming objects that either trigger freezing or running and hiding. There's a brain area that's in your brain and my brain that mice also have that triggers a third option, not run and hide, not freeze, but forward confrontation. This is the, no, I'm going to fight. I'm going to move forward in the face of adversity. This is the growth mindset. I'm going to lean into friction. And it turns out that this circuit is linked to the dopamine reward pathway. When we move forward in the face of a threat, and obviously we want to do this in healthy, adaptive ways, we suppress activity of the amygdala through physical action of moving forward, and there's a signal sent to the areas of the brain that control dopamine reward. Those reward centers then trigger the release of dopamine to reward forward effort in the face of stress or threat. So when you hear about people saying, look, take some physical action when you're feeling exhausted. Take some forward physical action when you're feeling overwhelmed by this traumatic experience. Now, that could be in the form of a walk. Now, this therapist, she figured out with EMDR, because you can't take people walking around for therapy sessions, she figured out that these lateralized eye movements are what triggers suppression of the amygdala. And it makes perfect sense, because the amygdala, this threat detection center in our brain, it doesn't connect to the limbs. So how does it know if you're moving forward? Well, because the eyes are moving. You have these reflexive eye movements that move anytime you're moving through space. So to make this a little more succinct, it's really forward movement, action, pushing yourself across that threshold, not only rewards you, but it suppresses activity of the fear centers in the brain. And these are ancient hardwired mechanisms. These aren't hacks. These are things that Mother Nature installed in us.
Rule number 9, create positive thoughts.
I'm a big fan of wellness, and I think it's a great community, but it tends to run in absolutes, and there aren't a lot of operational definitions, as we say in science. And what I love about your question is you're asking for really getting to the meat of things, asking for the operational definitions. One of the most dangerous ideas in wellness and in popular psychology is that your body hears every thought you have. What a terrible thing to put on people. You know, what a challenging thing. I don't think people should try and suppress their negative thoughts. I think there is great value, however, to introducing positive thought schemes. Now, the reason is not because I think it's just because I think so, but because there's actually a neurochemical basis for controlling stress and actually making stress more tolerable and extending one's ability to be in bouts of effort. And that relates to the dopamine pathway. So the molecule dopamine is a reward. It's released in the brain when you win a game, you close a deal, you meet the love of your life, someone likes your photo, the great love of your life, you complete something. But most of our dopamine release is not from achieving goals. It's actually released when we are en route to our goals, when we're in pursuit of our goals, and we think we're on the right path.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is meditate.
One meditation, very short, 5 minutes, where for one breath, you close your eyes and go internal, and you get behind, and some people call it the third eye, right? I'm gonna get the language wrong, but we all know what we're talking about. You get inside your breath, And then the second thing you do is you focus on something at a short distance. There's a powerful system in your brain when you focus both eyes on a single point, like a watchmaker making a watch, or you're reading. That state is accessing very specific channels in your brain that are very different from the one that when you close your eyes, okay? And it's called a vergence eye movement when you put both your eyes on the same thing. And then the last one is the one that we get a lot of here, that feeling, awesome feeling when you go out to the beach or you're on the top of a mountain or you look at the horizon or you arrive in New York City if you're me and you just go, oh my God, and you're defocused. And that's when these ideas, the creativity kind of spontaneously geysers up from below. But then you have to get back and you need to get to work on something. And so what's been very powerful, and we're putting patients through this, or subjects in brain imaging, is this way of accessing all these different brain states is really about accessing different notions of space and time, trying to get access to your whole brain. And it's a short meditation. I recommend just one breath at each of these kind of stations, in your mind, up close and focusing on your hand, and out. And I'll repeat that a few times during my morning, or maybe once or twice during the day. It's quick, and we're getting remarkable feedback from the people that are doing this about the kind of state that it puts them in, both engaged and present with the bigger picture. And in the end, it's all about the bigger picture, right? Because it's about not just what you do with your life, but how you're gonna create good in the world.
Now I've got a special bonus clip that I think you're gonna enjoy. But before that, it's time for the question of the day. I wanna know, what was your single biggest takeaway from this video and your plan of action for the next week? When you watch a video and just get motivated, the science says you have a 35% chance of actually following through on your goals. That's not good enough. No, not for you, Believe Nation. We gotta do something. But when you write it down and you create a specific plan of action for the next week, that number jumps to 91% chance of you following through. And when you commit to somebody else, like leaving a comment on this video, it jumps to 95%. You need to follow through on your goals. So what was your single biggest takeaway from this video and your specific plan of action for the next week? Put it down in the comments below so I can celebrate you.
Bring as much focus to a behavior or to a thought or to an action pattern. And there has to be a sense of urgency. So what Knudsen lab showed, and another lab at UCSF, Mike Merzenich's lab showed, is that if there's a serious contingency, like in order to get your ration of food each day, you have to learn this thing, the degree of plasticity is remarkable.
Right.
But if there isn't an incentive, it just isn't gonna happen. So these circuits in the brain that Mother Nature set up are designed to be anchored to a real need. And people always say to me, well, should I do something out of love and a real desire to learn, or should it be out of fear? But either one works. The sense of urgency is just acetylcholine. It's norepinephrine. That's all it is. The brain doesn't have a recognition of whether or not something is pleasurable or not until later. Once you start accomplishing your goal, the reward systems like dopamine start kicking in. But I think if people are interested in modifying their brain for the better, at least some, top contour understanding of how urgency and focus must converge for that to happen can be useful, because I think there's a lot of attention paid to whether or not something feels like flow, or whether or not it's what I call highly desirable states, or whether or not you can eat a plant out of the ground that will magically put your brain into a state of plasticity. And the answer is yes, such plants exist, but what's missing is the focus component. If that work is not done with a particular end goal in mind, you'll get plasticity, but you'll get plasticity in a kind of across the board. It's like learning learning a little bit of 9 languages all at once is not gonna make you speak coherently in any one of them. So focus is the key.
Can a person make it so they never get depressed? They never react to their perception, their people's actions towards them, where they never get to a state of, I don't feel good, I'm feeling more depressed, I'm in a dark place now, I'm stuck in this place. Is there a way that we could ever defend ourselves against negative stressors, negative emotions? Or do we need them as well to have contrast in life?
Well, there's sort of 2 views on this. I'll reveal mine after I explain the 2 views. One is that these states, I guess I'm automatically calling things like depression a state of mind and body. So when I say state of mind, I mean brain and body.
Because your body is really feeling, it's like the brain is connected to the body.
Right.
And so if you're saying internally the thought of like, I'm depressed, or I don't feel good, or I'm sad, or I'm lonely, or I'm not good enough, the body's going to react. Is that what I'm understanding?
Absolutely.
Like the body's going to manifest what the mind is telling you.
Absolutely.
The thought, the idea, you're going to be like, I'm sad, I'm not good enough, you're going to shrink.
Right.
Is that right?
That's right. I mean, there are really two forms of depression. Sometimes they're intermixed, but one is anxiety-associated depression. And you, if you've ever experienced it, or for anyone that's experienced it, they feel agitation in their body. And their mind races, but in their body. So the body is recruited. There are also depressive states that people feel very fatigued and exhausted. It's an overwhelm. And they also experience that in their body. The idea of getting out of bed in the morning is hard. Motivating to exercise, doing the sorts of things that we know are powerful for pushing back on depression. So the body is recruited. I think most people would say that depressive states are bad when they bring down the baseline on life. As a brief aside, anytime there's a question about mental health or addiction or trauma or anything, one could look at it and make up some argument of, well, evolutionarily, this makes sense, we all get depressed, but we have to be fair to the person experiencing it, of course, and have sensitivity that some behaviors will keep the baseline of our life steady, meaning job, relationships, et cetera, will continue as they are. Other activities will tend to improve the baseline on our life. Job, activities, relationship, et cetera, will improve. And then there's some things like heroin, which does very quickly, we can predict that very quickly the baseline on life is going to creep down regardless of who that person is, right? So people say, can you get addicted to water? Well, maybe, but I have to drink a lot of water before the baseline on my life starts to go down.
So it just feels uncomfortable.
That's
it's
right.
It's like, man, I'm so bloated
Exactly.
all day.
So we tend to throw around things like addiction and depression a little loosely. So
yeah.
I think that it's fair to say that depression is wired into us as a possible state that we could all fall into, but that it's very important, in my opinion, that humans have tools to remove themselves from that state, of course, to avoid tragedies like suicide, but also because when the baseline on someone's life goes down far enough, they find it increasingly hard to do the sorts of things that are going to get them out of depression. So you or I could say...
So they stay in that state of depression because
That's right.
It's too hard to go work out. It's too hard to change my habit of eating healthier, so I'm going to stay... I'm going to keep eating ice cream, which is going to make my body, depressed.
That's right.
Right? If I keep eating bad foods, if I keep staying up till 4 a.m., if I keep staying in a toxic relationship, I'm going to feel depressed.
That's right. And eventually, because of this very inseparable relationship between the brain and body, eventually what happens is that because the brain controls the body, but also the body can control the brain, people lose the ability to intervene in this depressive process. So you or I could say, look, if someone who's depressed, what they need to do is get up early, get some light in their eyes, get some movement. I know you put this information out there, which I love, because those tips are grounded in, they're not even tips, they're really tools.
Yes.
And they're very powerful because they're grounded in excellent science. You get that dopamine release early in the day that's antidepressive. You time your sleep better when you get sun in your eyes and you get movement early in the day. For most people, that's accessible, and they absolutely should be doing it. Everyone should be doing that. But for people who are far enough down that path of depression, because the body and the mind have this relationship that's so close, there is a crossover point where they really can't do those activities.
Because they're so far deep into depression.
The body won't do what they decide to do. And so, now I'm not trying to give anyone a pass, because ultimately we are all responsible for our own mental health. Certainly adults more than kids, but we're all responsible for our own mental health, and only we can direct our own brain changes. That's the stinger. Once we're 25 years and older, we are the only ones that can change our brain. And we can talk about neuroplasticity if you like, but the depressed person has to take responsibility for their behavior. But this is why it's so important to catch this brain-body relationship early and build routines that keep one out of depression. So that was a long path back to answer your question succinctly, I hope, which is we can stay out of depression, but we have to keep depression at bay by doing things regularly. One of the reasons why breathing is such a powerful tool for shifting one's state is that it's always available for voluntary control. It's just right there. I can decide right now to do 3 inhales, or I can just go back to breathing reflexively. I can just do that at any moment. So the neural real estate, which is in the brainstem that controls breathing, is
in a unique position because it's at the kind of boundary between conscious control and unconscious control. I can't do that for my digestion. I can't do that for most everything that happens internally. The other thing is that breathing controls our level of alertness very dramatically. So the faster you breathe, generally, the more alert you are. The slower you breathe, the more calm you're going to be.
The faster you breathe, meaning shorter, quick breaths, or
either way. So if we're just to take a brief adventure through the neuroscience of breathing and how it relates to brain states, and there's some fun tools in here, so forgive me for this tangent, but you have two brain areas that are responsible for breathing. One is called, for the aficionados, the pre-Buttsinger complex. It was discovered by Jack Feldman at UCLA. It's named after a bottle of wine, so now people won't forget it. And it controls rhythmic breathing. So inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. It's just rhythmic breathing. There's another brain area that controls breathing, which is near what's called the parafacial nucleus, which involves breathing anytime there are double inhales or double exhales or triple inhales. And you say, well, why would you have this second brain area for breathing? Well, it turns out when you're speaking or crying or coughing, you need to coordinate your breathing with your speaking. And that means sometimes you need to take multiple inhales or multiple exhales. And this is all happening very, very fast. You don't notice. But there's a very important discovery that was made a few years ago by Jack's lab and by a guy named Mark Krasno at Stanford, who discovered there's a set of neurons in your brainstem, my brainstem, everybody's brainstem, and every mammal's brainstem. It's a very small number of neurons that controls a specific pattern of breathing, which are called physiological sighs. So these are not just sighs where you go and exhale. These are sighs that involve doing 2 inhales and then an extended exhale.
We all do this.
You do this during sleep. Anytime carbon dioxide levels in your bloodstream get too high, in order to get more oxygen into your system. People also do this if they've been crying or sobbing. They'll do this and then they'll exhale. So what's happening with these physiological sighs and why is this powerful? So your lungs are 2 big bags of air, but they actually are made up of a ton of little sacs of air called the alveoli of the lungs. When we are exercising or when we are sleeping or anytime we're doing anything, these little sacs of air eventually start to collapse. And what happens is carbon dioxide builds up in our system and we experience that as stress. We actually feel the impulse to breathe because carbon dioxide levels get too high. There are neurons that sense carbon dioxide. And then without realizing it, you do a double inhale and then exhale. Typically the inhales are done through the nose and the exhale is done through the mouth. So it looks like. And why the second inhale? Well, if you've ever tried to blow up a balloon for a kid at a kid's party or just blown up a balloon, you sometimes blow into that empty balloon. It doesn't go anywhere. So what do? You do 2. You go, and then it pops open. So these double inhales pop open the alveoli of the lungs. They don't explode them, but they pop them open, which pulls carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream, brings oxygen, and then you offload carbon dioxide. So if you watch a dog right before it takes a nap or something, it often will do these. Now what's cool about these physiological sighs is from work in our lab, and that's still ongoing, I just want to say it's still ongoing, but work in other labs as well, double inhales followed by an extended exhale are the fastest way that I'm aware of to bring the mind and the body into a more relaxed state.
Really?
Yeah.
The fastest way. So if I'm stressed, I'm overwhelmed, just do a 3 or 2?
2 inhales through the nose, and then exhale slow through the mouth. 1 to 3 of those repeated will bring your level of autonomic arousal down basically to baseline.
I would hide in the Tower Books section in the evenings, and I would read everything about fitness, psychology, anything I could. I've always devoured information. My favorite book when I was a kid was the Encyclopedia or the Guinness Book of World Records. So I would, like, when I was a little kid, I'd walk around the Aspen Center for Physics and I would tell anyone. I didn't even ask them if they wanted to hear about what's the world's smallest eutherian mammal. You know, I would it could tell you all these facts that were kind of meaningless at the time, but I've always been fascinated by the inventory of different animals on the planet and their different behaviors. And so, yeah, voracious reader, and still now. Yeah, I love information.
Incidentally, or not so incidentally, I should say, when you look at communities of very high performers, and I'm fortunate enough to do some consulting with some people from special forces communities and so forth, they're very good, as are you, at attaching reward to specific behaviors in subjective ways. So growth mindset and these dopamine rewards that we subjectively apply are not about saying, oh, you know, I had a terrible day, I performed poorly, but you know what? It's great. I just feel great anyway. It's not about that. It's not about attaching your sense of reward to the ultimate goal. It's about attaching your sense of reward to the fact that you're making action steps that are generally in the right direction. The more you can reward the effort process, the better off you are at building these kinds of neural circuits and these kind of tendencies to be able to lean into anything challenging over essentially any duration.
There is something called adrenal insufficiency syndrome, which is a real medical phenomenon where the adrenals are incapable of making these cortisol and adrenal hormones. But the truth is that you have enough adrenaline and cortisol in your body to last 2 lifetimes and 25 famines. I mean, we were built with a lot of robustness, right? This explains, the David Goggins of the world. We all do have that greater capacity that people talk about. The stress is very misunderstood because people think of stress as this ancient carryover that's very unfortunate. It kind of gets lumped with depression, like, oh, this is just a flaw in our design or something. But actually, stress is wonderful. It actually activates our immune system. So anytime you liberate adrenaline into your bloodstream, you also protect yourself against infection of bacteria and viruses. Because if you think about it, if we had to gather food and we didn't have it, and we had to then pack up and migrate long distances, you can't afford to get sick. And this is why people who work, and then rest, they usually get sick when they finally stop and rest.
Really?
Yeah, it's like the post-finals phenomenon in university or after the season for a game, or the caretakers thing where you're taking care of somebody who's ill and you're just work, or taking care of young children, and then you finally stop to rest, you go on vacation and you get slammed with an illness.
Why is that? Because you're being in your comfort zone now? Or
because stress turned off. And adrenaline, so that the stress response recruits the immune organs of the body to release killer T cells. In fact, Wim Hof breathing, I know you're familiar with Wim, of doing 20 or 30 deep inhales and exhales, and also combined with some breath hold type work, exhale, hold, inhale, hold, is known to stimulate adrenaline release. And one of the better papers that's out there, scientific peer-reviewed papers, is a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where they brought in 2 groups. One group did Wim Hof breathing. The other group did just mindful meditation. Both groups were injected with E. coli. Right?
It's crazy.
Right?
It's crazy.
Right? It's crazy. The meditators got fever, diarrhea, and vomiting, and the people who did Wim Hof either didn't get it or got it to a much lesser extent.
Felt sluggish, but
that's
not.
Right. They didn't. Right.
Isn't that
this
crazy?
is not an experiment to do at home.
Isn't this crazy?
But it makes perfect sense because that breathing simulates a stress response. It stimulates cortisol and adrenaline, which
protects the body.
Right, which signals to the thymus, the spleen, and the other, the nodes of the immune system to liberate killer cells. And so when that bacteria comes in, the system is ready for it.
Your body is defending against viruses and disease, essentially. When you create a routine of healthy stress.
That's right. And we could talk about, we definitely you don't want stress on all the time. Sleep is really important, et cetera. But that stress response combats infection because it recruits immune cells. And I didn't have the power of concentration. I hadn't read all the good books that gun high school students read growing up. I had to learn how to speak properly. I learned how to think properly, and really learn how to commit to something that was very linear and at times was very painful. And I went to some pretty extreme things. I actually used to set a timer, and I wouldn't allow myself to get out of the chair until the timer went off.
Right.
So, and I would experience extreme agitation. But over time, I got pretty good, and now I can do long stints of work without any breaks.
What's interesting about growth mindset is that it seems like there's some attachment of the reward systems of the brain to the action or the pursuit of a goal, not just achieving a goal. And when we step back and we look at what that really entails at a neurochemical level, we have reward systems in the brain. They generally fall into 2 categories. There are the reward systems that make you feel really good with kind of the here and now and everything that's within the confines of your skin and the things you already have. Love of your dog, love of your spouse, gratitude for all the things you happen to have. And those are generally governed by the release of molecules like serotonin and oxytocin. Okay. But then there's another reward system, which is the one that drove a lot of human evolution, which is the dopamine reward system. Now, dopamine is a very misunderstood molecule. It's often talked about only in the context of reward. Like, I'm going to work to this goal. I'm going to build my company. I'm going to, get tenure as a professor, whatever it is. And you reach it and you get this dopamine reward. And indeed, that's true. But what's often not discussed is that dopamine is secreted en route to rewards while you pursue rewards. Now, the ability to tap into that system, to subjectively amplify that pathway of reward in pursuit of goals, is an absolute game changer when it comes to things like anything challenging that of long duration or uncertainty, or getting through this COVID, pandemic situation. But the amazing thing is, remember, the brain only does 5 things, and we get to decide which of those sensations and perceptions have relevance and which ones don't, or which ones are attached to a goal and which ones aren't. So growth mindset, in its purest form, is the attachment of these reward systems to the effort process, to the friction process, and not just to obtaining a reward. And just as a kind of final point to that, there's a very well-known body of literature in neuroscience, at least among neuroscientists, that talks about something called reward prediction error. And it says, if you can dose the dopamine subjectively as you go through the pursuit of something, and then have a lot of dopamine when you reach that thing, it's very likely that you're going to reinforce that circuit. There will be neural plasticity, and that circuit will become stronger. So the next time you will revisit those sets of behaviors. The opposite can happen too, where you're in real anticipation of something. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. And then you reach that goal and it's kind of underwhelming. And that generally triggers this circuit that I referred to earlier, this kind of disappointment or pro-depressive circuit. So dopamine is involved in reward, but it's also involved in the pursuit of rewards. And so as you reach a milestone, or as you tell yourself, I'm on the right track, this friction I'm feeling, this late night, this early morning, this hard conversation with somebody that doesn't feel good, I'm going to tell myself this is for a larger purpose. That's that subjective insertion, that abstraction that we were talking about earlier. And when you start releasing dopamine to those kinds of things, there's essentially no limit on the number of things you can do or the energy to do them. So just as a last point about dopamine, when we're in effort, we're always secreting adrenaline. We're always in pursuit, and it's draining, it's tiring. Dopamine has this beautiful capacity to buffer adrenaline. And you know this, you've experienced this before, because if you've ever been working really, really hard, maybe your team is depleted, everything's just a mess, and somebody cracks a joke, and all of a sudden, in an instant, it's like everything's reframed. That couldn't have been hormonal. Hormones work on the schedule of like hours to days to weeks. It had to be neurochemical. It absolutely had to be neurochemical, and that neurochemical is dopamine. The nervous system is responsible for everything that happens to us from the time that we're born until the time we die. But that really boils down to only 5 things. The nervous system has the responsibility of sensation, so sensing the physical events in the environment. We have these so-called receptors in the eyes, in the ears, in the nose, in the mouth, on the skin, that take physical entities in the universe that are real, fixed, non-negotiable things like sound waves and photons of light and chemicals in the environment traveling that make it into our nose and things like that, and convert those into the second thing, which is perceptions. So the nervous system's responsibility is to take those sensations, which are non-negotiable, and perceive certain ones and not others. So for instance, right now, until I say, what's the sensation of your feet contacting the floor or the bottoms of your shoes, you weren't thinking about it, but those pressure receptors were being engaged the entire time. So your perception is like a window or a spotlight that's very much linked to attention. Then there are emotions, often called feelings. And those are really designed to push us down particular avenues of perception. And the next thing, which are thoughts. Okay, so we've got sensation, perception, feelings, and then there are thoughts, which really have a lot to do with what we're perceiving and the way we're organizing those perceptions, what they mean. And generally that's put into the context of what we already know, or memories. And then the 5th thing is behaviors or actions. And of course, neurons are responsible for generating actions. And there are really 2 kinds of actions. There are the actions that you generate reflexively, like your breathing and your heart rate right now are largely reflexive. Or you could decide control of your respiration and make it voluntary, right? And not just reflexive. So those 5 things, sensations, perceptions, feelings, thoughts, and actions, really encompass all of our life experience. And that's from the very mundane of getting up in the morning and brushing your teeth to the most awe-inspiring, goal-motivated, pinnacle moments of your life. The nervous system, not the immune system, not the digestive system, all of which are important, but the nervous system, meaning the brain, spinal cord, and the connections with the body and the connections from the body back to the brain and spinal cord are responsible for all of that.
Why fear? Why do we have fears? Why do we have trauma? Why do we have shame? And here's the stinger. It was all set up for you in your youth. I don't want to focus on the bad, but most of this stuff when you're young, you're just a passive learning machine. It's all coming in. Little kids are learning 3 languages with no accents flexibly. They're not even thinking about it. They're learning instruments. You know, someone asked a great question the other day at the workshop. Wait, now I know I want all that stuff. How come it's so much tougher? And there's a lot of biology that I'd be happy to tell you about that explains why that all shuts down after these so-called critical periods during development. So what happens when you're an adult and you want to change your brain? So now I'm going to get into stuff that hopefully is useful to you. Okay, so these basic facts that changing your brain in a real way as an adult requires that you do particular things that activate particular chemical systems in your brain. So how do you do that, right? I could tell you all about the chemicals and I will tell you a little bit about them, but how do you do it? Okay, so this is a right here, right now, urgent situation, car wreck. It's terrible. You could imagine any other trauma in its place. When that happens, a little area in the base of the brain, the name isn't important, but if you care, it's called nucleus basalis, does its job, which is it's an alert system. It puts all its attention on right here, right now, get everybody safe. It's your alert system. And it has this effect of dumping out a certain chemical called acetylcholine at specific locations in the brain that are paired with that experience. And forever, that experience will be traumatic unless something else is done. Okay? So there's some nuance and some details to this, but that pretty much summarizes it. It's been replicated many, many times in dozens of studies. You can pair pretty much any experience with stimulation of nucleus basalis, this thing in the base of the brain, and that experience will be mapped or remapped in your brain as an adult. And that's remarkable. It's also exciting because then someone like me says, well, then how do I change my experience? How do I change the meaning of what happens? How do I change something from traumatic to positive? The good news is nucleus basalis is just a slave to whatever is exciting, traumatic. It likes emotion. It likes peaks and lows. And so if acetylcholine is released, that means you can massively change your brain at that moment with whatever's paired with it. And so when you get into a peak state here, and you're jumping up and down, or in a really low state and you're thinking how miserable something is, you have to be really careful because those are the things that you're wiring in, all right? So you can move to a state like this about driving later if you form enough associations with driving to really eliminate, to override the fear, you need to create a positive experience in its place. So how do you do that? So I'm gonna tell you that the way to do that is not to think too hard and to not verbalize things too much. And this is coming from someone who spent 25 years, 3 times a week on a couch, letting subconscious things geyser up. And that's where I really learned that it was really the things that you don't realize that have the potential to have the most impact. But this power of emotion, the ability to couple really strong emotions with things, is so useful if you want to change your brain for the better. And the way you do that is clear in the physical space. We all know this story. There are many news cases like this. Woman's child stuck under car, superhuman strength. We heard a lot of amazing stories about desperation. JJ's story was one of desperation. She's like, no, I'm not gonna accept failure because failure in the case she was describing was potentially the death of her child. So desperation is a strong one and it's motivated by fear. But what if you're not in a desperate state and you really wanna do something? In that case, there's something remarkable. And then we should ask ourselves, why are children such great passive learners? They're not trying, they're just learning. They're coming home with all sorts of things, sometimes things you don't want them to come home with, right? It's because they have this element of play. And what is play? Play isn't just movement, although it includes movement. It's giving things everything you've got, but keeping it in perspective. It's that sweet spot of enjoying life and trying really, really hard at it at the same time. It's essentially what we all strive for. And there are these incredible cases throughout history. Famous scientists, because I grew up in a house where people, revered scientists like Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner. He's most famous for bongo drumming naked on the roof of Caltech. And he became an amazing artist in his 60s. And he developed all sorts of other skills. And he always had this childlike way of looking at the world. He never let himself get stuck in his ways, never became a curmudgeon, and a remarkable man. And that's something that if you come away with nothing else, I encourage you to do that. You want your brain to change, stay light, stay loose, but give it everything you've got.
If you want 10 more amazing rules from Andrew Huberman, check out the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
It's that sweet spot of enjoying life and trying really, really hard at it at the same time.
I actually used to set a timer and I wouldn't allow myself to get out of the chair until the timer went off.